The amber sun blazed mercilessly over Dusty Ridge, casting long shadows across the cracked earth that hadn't seen proper rain in 14 months. Every blade of grass had surrendered to the relentless heat, leaving behind a landscape painted in shades of brown and desperation. Even the tumbleweeds had given up their wandering, too withered to catch the occasional hot breeze that offered no relief, only the false promise of movement in a world that had grown still with drought. Marcus Reed wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he hammered another loose board back into place on his barn wall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Each strike of a hammer echoed across his property like a gunshot in the silence, the only sound besides the distant buzz of flies and the occasional creak of the windmill that had been spinning dry for months. His ranch, though modest by some standards, had once been his pride. Now it felt more like a burden he carried on shoulders that had grown heavy with responsibility and loss. The Triple Crown Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather, who'd carved it out of nothing but determination and sweat. Marcus had always planned to pass it on to his own children someday, but life had other plans. Some dreams, he'd learned, don't survive the harsh realities of Montana winters and economic downturns. Some dreams get buried alongside the people who shared them. His wife Elena had been gone 2 years now, taken by the fever that swept through their small community like wildfire. She'd always been the one who saw possibility where he saw problems, who painted pictures of their future in colors brighter than the sunrise over the eastern hills. Without her gentle optimism, the ranch felt hollow, like a house with all the windows boarded up. Marcus paused in his work, listening to a sound that didn't belong to his usual symphony of solitude. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the whisper of wind through the dry grass, but as it grew closer he recognized it for what it was, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of someone singing off-key. He straightened, shading his eyes against the glare, and squinted toward the dirt road that wound past his property, like a brown ribbon stretched across the prairie. What he saw made him question whether the heat had finally gotten to him, creating mirages where none should exist. A woman was approaching on foot, leading what appeared to be the sorriest excuse for a donkey he'd ever laid eyes on. The animal limped with each step, favoring its left front leg so dramatically that Marcus winced in sympathy. Its coat was patchy and dull, ribs visible beneath matted fur that looked like it hadn't seen a proper brushing in months. One ear drooped at an odd angle, and its tail swished with the resigned determination of a creature that had long ago accepted its lot in life. But it was the woman who truly caught his attention. She couldn't have been more than 30, with auburn hair that had escaped whatever attempt she'd made to contain it beneath a faded blue bandana. Her boots were caked with dust and mud from a dozen different roads, and her simple brown dress bore the telltale signs of hard travel. Yet despite her obviously difficult circumstances, she walked with her head held high, singing what sounded like an old hymn to her limping companion. As they drew closer, Marcus could make out more details. A small canvas pack was slung across her shoulders, bulging with what appeared to be her entire worldly possessions. Her face was sun-weathered but kind, with laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she hadn't always been walking dusty roads with a lame donkey. Most striking of all was the way she spoke to the animal, her voice carrying a mixture of affection and determination that spoke of deep loyalty between unlikely companions. Marcus found himself setting down his hammer and walking toward his fence line, drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. It had been so long since he'd seen another soul on this stretch of road that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to witness another person's story unfolding before his eyes. The woman noticed him as she approached the corner of his property, and she raised her hand in a tentative wave. Her smile was genuine but cautious, the expression of someone who'd learned to hope for kindness while preparing for disappointment. "Good afternoon," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. "I don't suppose you'd know how much farther it is to Cedar Falls?" Marcus removed his hat and ran his fingers through his dark hair, considering the question. Cedar Falls was a good day's walk from here, maybe more if you were traveling with a donkey that could barely put weight on one leg. "About 18 miles northeast," he replied, gesturing in the general direction. "You planning to walk it?" The woman glanced down at her companion, who had taken advantage of the stop to investigate a particularly interesting clump of weeds near the roadside. "We've walked farther," she said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the weariness in her voice. Haven't we, Cornelius?" The donkey looked up at the sound of his name, fixing Marcus with one intelligent brown eye, while continuing to chew thoughtfully. There was something almost dignified about the animal despite his obvious infirmities, as if he understood his role in this unlikely partnership and accepted it with grace. "Cornelius," Marcus repeated, unable to keep the amusement out of his voice. "That's quite a name for a donkey." "He came with it," the woman explained, reaching down to scratch behind the animal's good ear. "Previous owner said he was named after some Roman emperor or general, I forget which. Seemed fitting for a donkey with such noble bearing." Marcus looked at the scraggly, limping creature and tried to see the nobility she obviously found there. To his surprise, he could almost glimpse it in the way Cornelius held his head, in the patient acceptance of his circumstances, in the obvious trust he placed in his human companion. "I'm sorry," the woman continued, stepping closer to the fence. "I should have introduced myself. I'm Rachel Morrison. And you're very kind to give us directions." "Marcus Reed," he replied automatically, then found himself asking, "You got family in Cedar Falls?" A shadow crossed Rachel's face, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Possibly," she said carefully. "My aunt lives there, or did the last time I heard from her. That was about 3 years ago." 3 years was a long time, especially in communities like Cedar Falls where people came and went with the seasons and the economic tides. Marcus knew better than most how quickly circumstances could change, how the people you counted on could vanish from your life without warning. But he kept these thoughts to himself. "It's a fair piece to walk," he observed instead, "especially in this heat." Rachel glanced up at the sun, which showed no signs of offering mercy, despite the advancing afternoon. Sweat had beaded on her forehead, and he noticed the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot, a subtle sign that her boots might not be as comfortable as her steady pace suggested. "We've been walking since dawn," she admitted. "Cornelius needs frequent breaks, and we like to travel in the cooler hours when we can." Marcus found himself studying the donkey more closely. The limp was pronounced, and the animal's breathing seemed slightly labored despite the relatively easy terrain. "What happened to his leg?" "Wire fence about 2 weeks back," Rachel explained, her hand moving protectively to Cornelius's neck. "He got tangled up pretty good, trying to reach some green grass on the other side. The cut's healed clean, but he's been favoring it ever since." The way she spoke about the injury, with the practiced knowledge of someone who'd been dealing with animal ailments for weeks, told Marcus more about her circumstances than she probably intended. This wasn't a woman playing at hardship or adventure. This was someone who'd been genuinely struggling, caring for a lame animal while navigating an uncertain road toward an uncertain destination. "You said you've been walking since dawn," Marcus said slowly. "Where'd you start?" "Little camp about 12 miles back," Rachel replied. "Found a spot by a creek bed with some grass for Cornelius. Dry creek, mind you, but the grass was still green enough to keep him happy. 12 miles since dawn, with breaks for a lame donkey, in heat that could fell a healthy man." Marcus felt a grudging respect for this woman's determination, mixed with concern for her well-being. He'd seen what the sun could do to travelers who pushed too hard, especially those who might not have adequate water supplies. As if reading his thoughts, Rachel reached into her pack and pulled out a metal canteen that looked like it had seen better decades. She unscrewed the cap and took a careful sip, the kind of measured drink that spoke of someone monitoring their water supply closely. "Don't suppose there's a well or spring nearby?" she asked, trying to sound casual but not quite managing it. Marcus glanced toward his own property, where the windmill stood motionless above the deepest well in 3 counties. His grandfather had been smart enough to dig deep and lucky enough to hit an underground stream that had never run dry, even in the worst drought years. It was one of the few advantages his struggling ranch still possessed. "There's a well here," he found himself saying. "Good water, runs deep." Rachel's eyes lit up with genuine relief. "Would it be too much trouble? Just enough to fill the canteen and maybe a drink for Cornelius? I can pay you something for it." She was already reaching into her pack, presumably for whatever small coins she might have saved. The gesture struck Marcus as both dignified and heartbreaking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Here was a woman who clearly had little to spare, still insisting on paying her way. "Put your money away," he said gruffly. "Water's free to anyone who needs it." He unlatched the gate in his fence, a simple wooden affair that had been mended more times than he could count. "Come on in. Well's just over by the barn." Rachel hesitated for a moment, studying his face as if trying to gauge his intentions. Marcus realized this was probably wise caution on her part. A woman traveling alone, even with a donkey for protection, would need to be careful about accepting help from strangers. "I promise I'm not in the habit of luring travelers into my yard," he said, with what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Just offering water. Nothing more." After another moment's consideration, Rachel led Cornelius through the gate. The donkey immediately perked up, his ears swiveling forward as he caught the scent of hay from the barn. Despite his obvious pain, he quickened his limping pace, drawn by the promise of food in a way that spoke of too many days without adequate nourishment. "Easy, boy," Rachel murmured, keeping a firm grip on his lead rope. "Let's get you some water first." The well stood in the shade of the old windmill, its wooden cover worn smooth by decades of use. Marcus lifted the heavy lid and began working the hand pump, feeling the familiar resistance that meant water was rising from the depths. The first few strokes brought up air, then a trickle, then a steady stream of clear, cold water that sparked in the afternoon sunlight. Rachel held her canteen under the flow first, filling it completely before capping it carefully. Then she cupped her hands and drank deeply, the relief on her face unmistakable. "That's the sweetest water I've tasted in weeks," she said gratefully. Marcus found an old bucket and filled it for Cornelius, who buried his muzzle in the water and drank with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been dreaming of exactly this moment. The donkey drank steadily, pausing only to raise his head and look around as if making sure this wasn't too good to be true. "He's been worrying about water," Rachel explained, watching her companion with obvious affection. Animals know when they're running low on options. While Cornelius drank, Marcus found himself studying Rachel more closely. Her clothes were worn but clean, mended in several places with careful stitches that spoke of someone who took pride in their appearance, despite difficult circumstances. Her hands showed the calluses of hard work, but her nails were clean, and her hair, despite its escaped state, had obviously been washed recently. Most telling of all was the way she watched Cornelius, with the careful attention of someone whose entire world had narrowed down to the well-being of one stubborn, lame donkey. There was love there and loyalty, and the kind of fierce protectiveness that spoke of a bond forged through shared hardship. "How long have you two been traveling together?" Marcus asked. "About 4 months now," Rachel replied, stroking Cornelius's neck as he finished drinking. "He belonged to my neighbor back in Kansas. When I had to leave, old Mr. Patterson said Cornelius was too lame to be worth anything to anyone. Told me I could have him if I wanted the trouble of caring for a useless animal." Her voice carried a note of indignation that made Marcus suspect there was more to that story than she was sharing. "Useless seems harsh," he observed. "Mr. Patterson wasn't known for his kindness," Rachel said simply, "especially not to animals that couldn't earn their keep. But Cornelius has been anything but useless. He carries my pack when I'm too tired to manage it, warns me when strangers are approaching, and keeps me company when the road gets lonely, which is most of the time." The loneliness in her voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus caught it anyway. He recognized it because he'd been carrying his own version of it for 2 years now. The kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from having no one who truly knows you, no one whose welfare matters as much as your own. "Kansas is a long way from here," he said carefully. "What brings you to Montana?" Again, that shadow crossed her face. "Change of circumstances," she said diplomatically. "Sometimes you have to leave one life behind to find another." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of words not spoken. He'd learned that people on the road often carried stories they weren't ready to share, histories that had driven them from familiar places toward uncertain futures. He'd also learned that pressing for details usually drove people away faster than showing them the gate. Cornelius had finished his water and was now investigating the area around the well with obvious interest. His limp seemed less pronounced now that he was hydrated, though Marcus could see he was still careful about putting full weight on that front leg. "He's looking for something," Rachel observed, following her companion's gaze toward the barn. "Probably smells the hay," Marcus said. I've got about half a ton stored in the loft. Been saving it for winter, but with the drought, I'm not sure how many animals I'll have left to feed by then. The admission slipped out before he could stop it, revealing more about his own circumstances than he'd intended. Rachel looked at him with sudden understanding, recognizing a fellow traveler on the road of hard choices and dwindling options. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It's been a difficult time for everyone, hasn't it?" Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with sympathy but appreciating her understanding. "Ranching's always been a gamble. Some years you win, some years you lose. This is just a losing streak that's lasted longer than most." Cornelius had wandered closer to the barn and was now gazing longingly at the closed doors, his head tilted in a way that suggested he was hoping someone might take the hint. Despite his obvious hunger, he made no attempt to force his way in or create a disturbance. He simply stood there with the patience of a creature who'd learned that good things sometimes came to those who waited politely. "He's got good manners for a donkey," Marcus observed. "Better than most people I've met," Rachel replied with a smile. "He was well trained before his injury. Worked a small farm, carried loads, gave rides to children. He knows how to behave around people and property." Something in her tone suggested she was making a point, though Marcus wasn't sure what it might be. He found himself really looking at the donkey for the first time, trying to see past the limp and the rough coat to the animal underneath. Cornelius was larger than he'd first appeared, with the broad back and sturdy build of a working animal. His eyes were bright and intelligent, alert to everything around him while still maintaining that air of patient dignity. Even his limp couldn't disguise the fact that he'd once been a strong, capable beast of burden. "What kind of work did he do?" Marcus asked. "Hauling supplies, mostly," Rachel explained. The farm was pretty remote, and Cornelius could navigate trails that were too narrow or steep for a horse and wagon. He'd carry tools, food, even helped move fence posts when they were building new pastures. Despite himself, Marcus was impressed. Moving fence posts was back-breaking work even with proper equipment. A donkey who could handle that kind of load over difficult terrain would indeed be valuable to a working farm. Could he still do that kind of work? He heard himself asking. "Once his leg heals, I mean." Rachel's expression became carefully neutral. "I believe so. The injury was to the soft tissue, not the bone. With proper rest and care, there's no reason he couldn't return to light work eventually." Light work. The phrase hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibilities that Marcus wasn't quite ready to examine. He had plenty of light work around the ranch, tasks that required patience and steady effort rather than speed or strength. Hauling water to distant fence lines, carrying tools to repair sites, moving feed to animals in outlying pastures. More importantly, he had hay. Hay that Cornelius clearly needed. Hay that would otherwise go to waste if Marcus continued losing livestock to the drought and economic pressures. It would be practical to put the hay to use feeding an animal that might actually provide some value in return. That was the practical consideration. The emotional consideration was more complicated. Marcus realized he was enjoying this conversation more than any he'd had in months. There was something about Rachel's straightforward manner and obvious devotion to her donkey that appealed to him. She wasn't asking for charity or trying to manipulate his sympathies. She was simply traveling toward an uncertain destination with a lame donkey, accepting whatever help was offered and paying her way when she could. But Cedar Falls was 18 miles away, and the afternoon was wearing on. Even if they left immediately, they'd be walking in the dark, with a donkey who could barely manage normal terrain in daylight. The smart thing would be to suggest they camp somewhere along the road and continue in the morning. The practical thing would be to give them directions and wish them well. The kind thing would be to offer them a place to rest for the night. Marcus found himself weighing these options while Rachel checked Cornelius's injured leg, running her hands gently over the swollen area, with the practiced touch of someone who'd been monitoring the healing process for weeks. "How's it look?" he asked. "Better than it was," she replied honestly. "The swelling's gone down, and he's putting more weight on it today than yesterday, but it's still tender, and I don't like to push him too hard on unfamiliar ground." She straightened and looked toward the road, calculating distances and travel time with the careful consideration of someone whose safety depended on making good decisions. "We should probably head out soon if we want to make decent progress before dark." But even as she said it, Marcus could see the reluctance in her posture. Cornelius was clearly enjoying his brief respite, standing in the shade with his head lowered in contentment. Rachel looked tired despite her determination, and the thought of them walking 18 miles on dusty roads in the heat made something in Marcus's chest tighten with concern. "You could stay the night," he heard himself saying, "if you wanted to. There's clean straw in the barn for your donkey, and I've got a spare room in the house that's not being used for anything important." Rachel's head snapped up, surprise clear on her face. "That's very generous, but we couldn't impose." "Wouldn't be an imposition," Marcus interrupted, then felt compelled to add, "Truth is, I haven't had company in longer than I care to admit. Might be nice to have someone to cook for besides myself." He could see her considering the offer, weighing the risks of accepting help from a stranger against the very real challenges of continuing their journey in less than ideal conditions. Her gaze moved from him to Cornelius, who was now investigating a patch of dried grass near the barn with obvious interest. "I could help with chores," she offered tentatively. "Earn our keep somehow. I'm handy with repairs, and I know my way around animals." Marcus felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "We could work something out," he agreed. "See how it goes." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her concerns, because she slowly nodded. "All right," she said. "One night. But only if you let me help with whatever needs doing around here. I don't accept charity." "Understood," Marcus replied, though privately he thought anyone traveling with a lame donkey toward an uncertain destination had probably redefined charity more than once in recent months. He led them toward the barn, sliding open the heavy wooden doors to reveal the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through the doorway, illuminating stalls that had once housed a dozen head of cattle and 3 working horses. Now only 2 stalls were occupied by his remaining mare and the old gelding he couldn't bring himself to sell, despite their reduced circumstances. Cornelius perked up immediately at the scent of hay and the sound of other animals moving about in their stalls. He pulled gently on his lead rope, eager to investigate these new surroundings, his limp temporarily forgotten in his excitement. "Third stall's empty," Marcus said, gesturing toward a clean space with fresh straw on the floor. "Water bucket's already in place, and I can bring down some hay once you get 'em settled." Rachel led Cornelius into the stall, where he immediately began investigating every corner with the thoroughness of a creature who'd learned to appreciate good accommodations when he found them. The donkey sniffed the water bucket, tested the quality of the straw with one careful hoof, and then turned to gaze at the ladder leading up to the hayloft with unmistakable longing. "He knows what's up there," Rachel observed with amusement. "Smart animal," Marcus replied, climbing the ladder to fork down several generous portions of hay. The sweet smell of timothy and alfalfa filled the air as he tossed it down, and Cornelius immediately abandoned his exploration to bury his muzzle in the pile. The sound of contented chewing filled the barn as Marcus climbed back down and watched Rachel settle her few possessions in the corner of the stall. Her movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting she'd done this many times before in many different places. "He'll be happy as a king in here," she said, running her hand along Cornelius's neck as he ate. It's been a while since he's had accommodations this nice. Marcus found himself curious about what kind of accommodations they'd been finding along their journey, but he kept the question to himself. Rachel would share what she wanted to share, when she was ready to share it. "Let me show you the house," he said instead. "Get you settled before I start on the evening chores." They left Cornelius happily working his way through the hay and walked toward the small ranch house that had been Marcus's home for 15 years. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a simple wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a tin roof that sang in the rain. But it was solid and clean, built to withstand Montana winters and prairie winds. "It's lovely," Rachel said as they climbed the front steps, and something in her voice suggested she genuinely meant it. Marcus tried to see his home through her eyes as they entered the front room. The furniture was simple but well made, most of it built by his grandfather's hands decades ago. Elena's touches were still evident in the curtains she'd sewn, the quilts she'd made, the small garden visible through the kitchen window where her flowers still bloomed despite his neglect. "Guest room's just down the hall," he said, leading her toward a small bedroom that had been intended as a nursery but had never served that purpose. "Clean sheets on the bed, and there's a wash basin on the dresser." Rachel paused in the doorway, taking in the simple furnishings and the window that looked out toward the mountains in the distance. "This is perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Something in her tone made Marcus suspect that perfect accommodations had been rare in her recent experience. The thought stirred an unexpected protectiveness in him, along with curiosity about what circumstances had set her on this uncertain road, with only a lame donkey for company. "I'll let you get settled," he said. "Supper's usually around 6. Nothing fancy, but there's plenty. And feel free to clean up, rest, whatever you need." Rachel nodded, already moving toward the wash basin with obvious relief. "I'll be out to help with chores in a bit," she promised. "Just need a few minutes to make myself presentable." Marcus left her to her privacy and walked back outside, where the afternoon was beginning its slow fade toward evening. The temperature had dropped a few degrees, but the air still shimmered with heat above the dusty ground. He could hear Cornelius moving around in his stall, the comfortable sounds of an animal settling in for the night. For the first time in months, the evening chores ahead didn't feel like a burden to be endured alone. There would be someone to talk to while he fed the remaining animals, someone to share a meal with when the work was done. The prospect filled him with something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope, maybe, or just the simple pleasure of human company after too many months of solitude. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself looking forward to the evening ahead as he hadn't looked forward to anything in longer than he cared to remember. And if that meant he'd have to face questions about Rachel and Cornelius's future in the morning, well, that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in 2 years, he wouldn't be eating supper alone. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, dragging Marcus from the deepest sleep he'd enjoyed in months. For a moment, he lay still in his bed, disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of having slept peacefully through the night without the usual parade of worries marching through his mind. Then he remembered. Rachel and Cornelius were here, settled in his barn and guest room respectively, and somehow their presence had chased away the restless ghosts that normally kept him tossing until the small hours. He dressed quickly in the dim light filtering through his bedroom window, pulling on worn jeans and a cotton shirt that had seen better years. Outside, the world was painted in shades of gray and silver, with the promise of another scorching day already evident in the stillness of the air. But these early morning hours were precious, cool enough for real work before the sun turned everything into a furnace. Moving quietly to avoid waking his guest, Marcus made his way to the kitchen and started a pot of coffee on the old wood stove. The familiar ritual of measuring grounds and stoking the fire centered him, preparing him for whatever this day might bring. He had extended the invitation to stay one night, but already he found himself hoping Rachel might consider extending that arrangement. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted his thoughts. Through the kitchen window, he watched Rachel emerge from the barn, her hair neatly braided despite the early hour. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to starting her days before the sun, and something about her competent manner suggested she'd already been checking on Cornelius. Marcus opened the front door before she could knock. "Morning," he said quietly. "Coffee's just about ready." "Good morning," she replied, wiping her boots carefully on the mat before stepping inside. "I hope I didn't wake you." Cornelius was restless, and I wanted to check his leg before the day got too warm. "How's he doing?" Rachel's face brightened with genuine relief. "Much better. The swelling's down noticeably, and he's putting almost full weight on it this morning." That good rest and proper feed made all the difference. They moved to the kitchen together, falling into an easy rhythm as Marcus poured coffee and Rachel examined the simple breakfast supplies he'd laid out. "I could make pancakes," she offered, already reaching for the flour canister. "If you don't mind me taking over your kitchen for a bit." "Haven't had pancakes in 2 years," Marcus admitted, settling into a chair at the small wooden table. "Elena used to make them every Sunday morning." He waited for the familiar stab of pain that usually accompanied mentions of his late wife, but it didn't come. Instead, he felt only a gentle melancholy, the kind that acknowledged loss without being consumed by it. Rachel glanced at him with understanding but didn't press for details. "Sunday pancakes are a fine tradition," she said simply, beginning to mix batter with practiced efficiency. My mother did the same thing when I was growing up. Said it made the Lord's Day feel special. As she worked, Marcus found himself studying her movements. There was something soothing about watching someone who clearly knew their way around a kitchen, someone who approached even simple tasks with care and attention. Rachel measured ingredients by sight, mixed the batter just enough to combine it, and heated the cast iron skillet to exactly the right temperature. "You mentioned you could help with repairs," Marcus said, watching her pour perfect circles of batter onto the hot surface. "What kind of work have you done?" "Little bit of everything," Rachel replied, flipping the first pancake with a practiced motion. "My father believed girls should know how to fix what breaks, same as boys. I can mend fences, patch roofs, shoe a horse if needed. Did most of the maintenance on our farm back in Kansas." "Your farm?" A shadow crossed her face, the same careful expression he'd noticed whenever her past came up. "Was my husband's farm, technically. David inherited it from his father, along with the debt that came with it." She paused in her cooking, staring down at the skillet. "When he died, the bank decided a woman couldn't manage the payments alone." Marcus felt anger kindle in his chest on her behalf. He'd seen too many banks foreclose on properties they'd rather sell to developers or larger operations, using any excuse to claim land that had been in families for generations. "They wouldn't work with you?" "For about 6 months they pretended to consider it," Rachel said, her voice carefully controlled. "Kept asking for more documentation, more proof that I could handle the financial obligations. Meanwhile, they were quietly arranging to sell the land to a cattle company that wanted to expand their grazing rights." The bitter experience in her voice told Marcus more than the words themselves. Rachel had been maneuvered out of her home by people who'd made their decision before they'd even pretended to give her a fair chance. "So you packed up and headed for Montana?" "Not right away." Rachel stacked the finished pancakes on a plate and started another batch. "I tried to make a go of it in town for a while. Took work cleaning houses and mending clothes. But Kansas held too many memories, and too many people who looked at me with pity every time I walked down the street." She glanced toward the window, where the eastern sky was beginning to show hints of pink. "My Aunt Catherine used to write me letters about Montana, about how it was a place where people could start fresh regardless of their past. When Mr. Patterson offered me Cornelius, it felt like a sign that it was time to find out if she was right." Marcus poured syrup over his stack of pancakes, considering her story. 3 years since you've heard from your aunt, though." "I know the chances are slim that she's still in Cedar Falls," Rachel admitted, "but I have to try. Cornelius and I can't keep wandering indefinitely, and if Aunt Catherine isn't there, at least Cedar Falls is supposed to be a growing town with opportunities for work." The pragmatism in her voice impressed Marcus. Rachel wasn't chasing romantic dreams of reunion with long-lost family. She was simply following the most reasonable path available to her, hoping for the best while preparing for more practical outcomes. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, watching the sun gradually paint the mountains in shades of gold and orange. The coffee was strong and hot, the pancakes light and perfectly sweet, and for a few minutes, Marcus allowed himself to pretend this was simply how mornings were supposed to unfold. "What needs doing around here today?" Rachel asked as they finished eating. Marcus considered the endless list of maintenance tasks that had been accumulating during his months of barely keeping ahead of the most critical repairs. "North fence line needs attention," he said finally. "Several posts are loose, and there's a section where the wires come down completely. Been meaning to get to it for weeks." "I could help with that," Rachel offered. "Cornelius might even be able to carry some tools once we see how his leg handles easy work." The casual way she included herself and her donkey in his ranch work sent an unexpected warmth through Marcus's chest. It had been so long since anyone had offered to share his burdens that he'd almost forgotten what partnership felt like. "You sure you want to spend your time fixing someone else's fences?" he asked. Rachel met his eyes directly. "I'm sure I don't want to spend it sitting idle while someone who's shown me kindness struggles with work I could help with." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't just politeness or obligation. Rachel genuinely wanted to help, to contribute, to be useful rather than simply tolerated. Marcus recognized the feeling because he'd carried it himself during the lean years when neighbors had helped him through Elena's illness. "All right then," he said, standing to clear their breakfast dishes. "Let's see what Cornelius thinks about earning his hay." They found the donkey standing alert in his stall, ears pricked forward at the sound of their approaching voices. The improvement in his condition was remarkable after just one night of good food and rest. His coat seemed brighter, his posture more confident, and when he stepped forward to greet them, his limp was barely noticeable. "Well, look at you," Rachel murmured, running her hands over his legs to check for any remaining swelling. "Feeling better this morning, aren't you?" Cornelius nudged her shoulder affectionately, then turned his attention to Marcus with obvious interest. The donkey studied him for a moment before extending his neck to sniff at Marcus's shirt pocket, where he'd tucked a couple of sugar cubes from breakfast. "Smart boy," Marcus said, offering the treats on his palm. Cornelius accepted them with delicate precision, careful not to nip even accidentally. "Got good manners for a donkey." "He was well trained," Rachel said proudly. "The farmer who owned him before Mr. Patterson taught him to work with people, not against them. Makes all the difference when you're trying to get real work done." Marcus gathered the tools they'd need for fence repair, while Rachel fitted Cornelius with a simple pack saddle she'd been carrying in her belongings. The donkey stood patiently as she adjusted the straps, clearly familiar with the routine. When she loaded the pack with fence staples, wire cutters, and a small hammer, Cornelius shifted slightly to balance the weight, but showed no signs of distress. "We'll start easy," Marcus said, studying the donkey's gait as they headed toward the damaged fence line. "See how he handles the walking before we add more weight." The north pasture stretched across gently rolling terrain dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stunted tree. Under normal circumstances, it would have been prime grazing land for cattle, but the drought had reduced it to little more than dirt and rocks. Still, Marcus maintained the fences out of habit and hope, knowing that good rains would eventually return even if he couldn't predict when. The first damaged section was about half a mile from the barn, where a fence post had rotted through at ground level and taken down 20 feet of wire with it when it fell. Marcus had been putting off this particular repair because it required digging a new post hole in ground that had turned hard as concrete during the dry spell. "This is going to be a job," he said, examining the fallen post. "Ground's like iron this time of year." Rachel knelt beside the damaged section, running her hands along the wire to assess what could be salvaged. "Wire looks good still," she observed. "Just needs proper support again." Cornelius had wandered a few steps away and was investigating something in the dirt with obvious interest. When Marcus looked closer, he realized the donkey had found a small patch of grass that had somehow survived in the shade of a boulder, green and tender, despite the drought conditions around it. "Leave some for next time," Rachel told her companion with amusement. "We might need that patch for emergencies." Marcus began the laborious process of digging a new post hole, using a combination of pickaxe and shovel to break through the hard-pan soil. The work was hot and frustrating, with each swing of the pick producing only small chips of dirt and stone. Sweat soaked through his shirt within minutes, despite the early hour. "Let me spell you," Rachel offered after watching him struggle for several minutes. "I can handle it," Marcus replied automatically, then caught himself. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially when there was willing help available. "Actually, if you don't mind, that would be good. Been a while since I had someone to trade off with." Rachel took the pickaxe and attacked the stubborn ground with systematic determination. Her technique was different from his, using shorter, more precise strikes that seemed to find the weak points in the hardpan more effectively. Within minutes, she'd deepened the hole more than he'd managed in twice the time. "Where'd you learn to dig like that?" Marcus asked admiringly. "Rock-hard Kansas clay," Rachel replied without pausing in her work. "Learned early that fighting the ground just wears you out. Better to work with it, find the cracks and seams where it wants to give way." As she worked, Cornelius positioned himself nearby, occasionally offering encouraging praise, but mostly just providing companionable presence. The donkey seemed to understand that work was happening, and he was part of it, even if his role was currently limited to moral support. When the hole was finally deep enough, they worked together to position the new fence post, with Marcus holding it steady, while Rachel packed dirt and rocks around its base. The physical coordination required brought them into close proximity, and Marcus found himself acutely aware of Rachel's competence and determination. "You've done this before," he observed as she tamped the soil with practiced efficiency. "More times than I care to count," Rachel replied. Fences have a way of needing constant attention, especially in weather like this. They moved on to the next damaged section, where several posts had pulled loose from the hard ground, creating dangerous sags in the wire that could trap or injure livestock. This repair went more smoothly, requiring mainly retightening and restapling rather than complete replacement. By mid-morning, they'd restored nearly a quarter-mile of fence line, working with an efficiency that surprised Marcus. Rachel's experience showed in every aspect of the work, from the way she handled tools to her instinctive understanding of how fences should be positioned and tensioned. "You know," Marcus said as they paused to water Cornelius and themselves, "I could use help like this on a regular basis." Rachel looked up from checking her donkey's pack straps. "Regular basis?" Marcus felt his heart speed up as he approached the suggestion he'd been considering all morning. "The ranch needs work, more than I can handle alone, and you need a place to stay while Cornelius finishes healing." He gestured toward the remaining fence lines stretching into the distance. "Could take weeks to get all the repairs done properly. Room and board, plus wages for the work. Give you time to plan your next move instead of rushing toward an uncertain situation in Cedar Falls." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the careful attention he was beginning to recognize as her way of assessing new situations. "What kind of wages?" she asked finally. $2 a day, plus keep for you and Cornelius," Marcus replied. "Fair rate for fence work and general ranch maintenance." "That's generous," Rachel said slowly. "But I need to ask, is this charity dressed up as employment, or do you genuinely need the help?" The directness of her question caught Marcus off guard, but he appreciated her honesty. "Look around," he said, gesturing toward the endless list of repairs visible in every direction. "Does this look like a ranch that has more help than it needs?" Rachel followed his gaze, taking in the sagging barn roof, the corral fence that needed painting, the irrigation ditches that required clearing, the dozens of other tasks that had been deferred during his months of simply trying to keep the most essential operations running. "You could hire men from town," she pointed out. "Probably find workers who don't come with a lame donkey." "Could," Marcus agreed, "but good workers cost more than I can afford right now, and most of the available hands in town drink more than they work." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Besides, I've gotten used to having you and Cornelius around. Makes the work feel less like drudgery and more like progress." Something in Rachel's expression softened at his honesty. "How long are we talking about?" "Month to start," Marcus suggested. "See how it works out for both of us. If it goes well, we could discuss a longer arrangement." Cornelius chose that moment to wander over and push his head against Marcus's shoulder, apparently endorsing the proposal. The donkey's timing was so perfect that both humans laughed despite the seriousness of their negotiation. "I think he's voting yes," Rachel observed. "Smart donkey," Marcus replied, scratching behind Cornelius's ears. "Knows a good deal when he sees one." Rachel was quiet for another moment, clearly weighing the practical benefits against whatever reservations she might have about staying in one place. "A month," she said finally, "with the understanding that either of us can reconsider if the arrangement isn't working." "Deal," Marcus said, extending his hand for her to shake. Rachel's grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of someone who understood the value of her word and expected the same from others. "Deal," she agreed. They spent the rest of the morning completing the fence repairs, working with renewed energy now that their immediate future was settled. Cornelius proved invaluable as a pack animal, carrying tools and supplies with patient efficiency while his leg continued to show improvement with gentle exercise. By noon, the sun had grown too intense for outdoor work, driving them back to the relative coolness of the barn and house. Marcus was pleased to discover that Rachel's idea of helping around the ranch extended to practical domestic tasks as well. While he tended to the animals, she swept the kitchen, organized his haphazard pantry, and started a pot of stew that filled the house with savory aromas. "You don't have to do all this," he said, finding her mending a tear in one of his work shirts with neat, precise stitches. "Part of earning my keep," Rachel replied without looking up from her needlework. "Besides, it's been a while since I've had a proper kitchen to work in. This is actually enjoyable." The afternoon passed in comfortable companionship, with Rachel tackling indoor tasks while Marcus caught up on equipment maintenance in the barn. Cornelius spent the hottest hours dozing in his stall, occasionally opening one eye to monitor the human's activities before returning to his well-deserved rest. As evening approached, they gathered on the front porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold. The temperature had finally dropped enough to make sitting outside pleasant, and the gentle evening breeze carried the sweet scent of the few remaining wildflowers blooming along the creek bed. "This is beautiful country," Rachel said, settling into the old wooden chair Marcus had positioned beside his own. "Elena always said the sunsets made up for all the hardships," Marcus replied. "Said God painted them special for folks tough enough to stick it out through the difficult times. She sounds like she was a wise woman, wise and stubborn and full of dreams bigger than this old ranch could hold." Marcus smiled at the memories. "She wanted to expand the operation, maybe raise horses along with cattle. Had plans for an orchard and a vegetable garden that could supply half the county. What stopped her?" "Time," Marcus said simply. "We thought we had more of it than we did." Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of understanding rather than pity. "I'm sorry for your loss." "I'm sorry for yours too," he replied. "Sounds like your David had big dreams as well." "Different dreams," Rachel said carefully. "David was more interested in preserving what his family had built than expanding it. Sometimes I think that's why the debt got so overwhelming. He couldn't adapt to changing times." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the deepening sky. Cornelius could be heard moving around in his stall, the gentle sounds of an animal settling in for another peaceful night. "Marcus," Rachel said eventually, her voice thoughtful, "I need you to know that I appreciate this opportunity more than I can express. But I also need you to understand that I won't stay anywhere I'm not genuinely wanted or needed. Meaning, if you're offering me work out of pity or loneliness, it won't end well for either of us." She turned to look at him directly. "I need to be here because I'm useful, not because you're being kind to a woman in difficult circumstances." Marcus considered her words carefully. "You want honesty? Always." "Then honestly, yes, I'm lonely. Yes, I feel sorry for what you've been through. But mostly, I'm impressed by how you've handled yourself, how you've taken care of Cornelius, how you've approached every challenge I've seen you face." He met her steady gaze. "I offered you work because I genuinely need help, and because watching you work today convinced me you're exactly the kind of help I need." Rachel studied his face in the dim porch light, apparently satisfied by whatever she saw there. "All right then, partners for a month, and we'll see where that leads." "Partners," Marcus agreed. As if summoned by their conversation, Cornelius's head appeared over his stall door, ears pricked forward as he gazed toward the house. The donkey's expression was so alert and interested that both humans laughed. "I think he approves," Rachel said. "Smart donkey," Marcus replied, already looking forward to tomorrow's work with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Marcus with its naturalness. Rachel proved to be everything she'd claimed, and more, approaching every task with competence and good humor that made even the most tedious maintenance work feel like progress towards something meaningful. Cornelius recovered rapidly under the regimen of good food, regular but gentle exercise, and proper veterinary attention. Marcus had insisted on having Doc Peterson drive out to examine the donkey's leg, and the old veterinarian had pronounced the healing excellent and the prognosis optimistic. "Another week or two of light work, and he'll be good as new," Peterson had said, watching Cornelius demonstrate his improved gait. "Might always have a slight stiffness in cold weather, but nothing that'll stop him from earning his keep." The donkey seemed to understand his improved status, carrying himself with renewed confidence as he hauled tools and supplies around the ranch. His relationship with Marcus deepened daily, the animal showing obvious pleasure in human companionship while maintaining his special bond with Rachel. But it was Rachel herself who proved the greatest revelation. Marcus had expected competence and gratitude, and he'd found both. What he hadn't expected was how much he would enjoy her company, how easily they would fall into patterns of shared work and comfortable conversation. Rachel had opinions about everything, from the best way to repair irrigation ditches to the most efficient method of organizing a tool shed. She asked thoughtful questions about ranch operations and offered practical suggestions based on her experience with Kansas farming. Most importantly, she listened when Marcus talked about his plans and dreams for the property, treating his ideas with respect, even when she disagreed with his methods. "You're thinking too small," she said one evening, as they reviewed his plans for next year's planting. This soil could support twice what you're planning if you rotated crops properly and improved the irrigation system. Improvements cost money I don't have, Marcus pointed out. Some improvements do, Rachel agreed. But some just require labor and planning. And some pay for themselves faster than you might think. She had sketched out a modified irrigation plan that would require digging new channels but would water nearly twice as much acreage with the same amount of precious well water. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity, routing water through a series of terraced beds that would allow gravity to do most of the work. "Where'd you learn about irrigation?" Marcus asked, studying her detailed drawings. "Necessity," Rachel replied. "David's farm had water problems too, though different ones than yours. Too much in spring, too little in summer. I spent a lot of time figuring out how to manage what we had." As the days passed, Marcus found himself looking forward to these evening conversations more than anything else in his routine. Rachel's mind was quick and practical, but she also had dreams and ambitions that extended beyond mere survival. Talking with her reminded him that ranching could be about building something meaningful, not just enduring until circumstances changed. The work progressed steadily under their combined efforts. The fence line was completely repaired and reinforced. The barn roof received new shingles where needed and fresh waterproofing throughout. The irrigation ditches were cleared and improved according to Rachel's design, resulting in water flow to areas that had been dry for months. Most satisfying of all, the ranch began to feel alive again. Cornelius's presence seemed to energize the other animals, his confident braying serving as a kind of morning alarm that got everyone moving with purpose. Rachel's efficient management of domestic tasks meant Marcus could focus on the outdoor work that required his strength and experience. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. For the first time since Elena's death, he found himself making plans that extended beyond simple maintenance and survival. With Rachel's help, he could envision expanding operations, maybe even achieving some of the dreams Elena had harbored for the property. It was this growing optimism that made the appearance of trouble all the more jarring when it finally arrived. Marcus first noticed the riders while he and Rachel were working on the southern fence line, a project they'd started after completing the more urgent northern repairs. 3 men on horseback, approaching at a deliberate pace that suggested official business rather than casual visiting. "Expecting company?" Rachel asked, following his gaze toward the approaching group. "No," Marcus replied, a knot of uneasiness forming in his stomach. "And around here, unexpected visitors usually bring unwelcome news." As the riders drew closer, Marcus recognized the lead figure with sinking certainty. Samuel Hartwell, president of the Dusty Ridge Bank, and a man who'd made a career of acquiring distressed properties for pennies on the dollar. Behind him rode 2 men Marcus didn't recognize, but their expensive clothes and calculating expressions marked them as the kind of investors who saw struggling ranches as opportunities rather than tragedies. "Mr. Reed," Hartwell called as he reined in his horse near the fence line. "Working hard, I see." "Mr. Hartwell," Marcus replied evenly. "What brings you out this way?" "Business, I'm afraid." Hartwell's attention shifted to Rachel, his expression growing speculative. "And who might this be?" "Rachel Morrison," she said before Marcus could respond. "Mr. Reed hired me to help with ranch maintenance." "Hired help," Hartwell repeated, though something in his tone suggested he found this explanation insufficient. "Interesting. I wasn't aware Mr. Reed's finances had improved to the point where he could afford employees." The insult was delivered with the polished smoothness of someone accustomed to using financial pressure as a weapon. Marcus felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "My finances are my business, Mr. Hartwell." "Actually, they're the bank's business as well," Hartwell replied with a thin smile. "Which is why I'm here." "Your mortgage payment is 3 months overdue, Mr. Reed." 3 months. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them. He'd been so focused on the improvements and progress of recent weeks that he'd almost managed to forget the growing debt that threatened to destroy everything he was working toward. "I'm aware of the situation," he said carefully. "I've been working on a plan to catch up the payments." "Plans are admirable," one of Hartwell's companions said, speaking for the first time. "But banks require actual money, not intentions." Rachel stepped closer to Marcus, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the mounted men. "Perhaps this discussion would be better held privately," she suggested. "Oh, I think you should hear this too, Miss Morrison," Hartwell said smoothly. After all, your employment situation is directly affected by Mr. Reed's financial difficulties. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. Get to the point, Hartwell. The point is simple, the banker replied. You have until the end of the month to bring your account current. Full payment of overdue amounts, plus penalties and fees. Otherwise, we'll be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings. How much? Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. $840, Hartwell said with obvious satisfaction. Plus interest and fees, of course. The amount was staggering, far more than Marcus could hope to raise in the remaining weeks of the month. He'd been optimistic about gradual improvement, but this deadline demanded immediate solutions he simply didn't have. That's a lot of money, Rachel said quietly. Indeed it is, Hartwell agreed, which is why my associates here have generously offered to purchase Mr. Reed's debt and provide him with a fresh start elsewhere. One of the other riders leaned forward in his saddle. We're prepared to offer a fair price for the property, enough to clear the debt and leave a small surplus for relocation expenses. What's fair about buying a man's home for less than it's worth? Rachel asked sharply. Fair is what the market will bear, the man replied coldly. And the market for drought-stricken ranches with delinquent mortgages is not particularly strong at the moment. Marcus studied the three men, noting the way they'd positioned themselves and the practiced nature of their presentation. This wasn't their first visit to a struggling ranch, and it wouldn't be their last. They had the process refined to an efficient system of financial pressure and legal maneuvering. I need time to consider my options, he said finally. Of course, Hartwell said with false sympathy. But remember, the deadline is firm. End of the month, or we proceed with foreclosure. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell turned back to Rachel with a predatory smile. Miss Morrison, you might want to consider seeking employment elsewhere. Working for a man who can't pay his bills is rarely a stable situation. After the riders disappeared over the rise, Marcus and Rachel stood in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over them like a dark cloud. The optimism and progress of recent weeks suddenly felt fragile and temporary, threatened by realities that couldn't be fixed with hard work and good intentions. $840, Rachel said eventually, plus fees and interest. Marcus added bitterly, probably closer to 1,000, when all is said and done. Do you have any of it? Marcus shook his head. Maybe $50 in savings, and whatever I could get for selling the remaining livestock. Not nearly enough. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the mountains as if seeking answers in their distant peaks. There might be another way, she said finally. What kind of way? She turned to face him, her expression serious and determined. What if we were partners? Real partners, not just employer and employee. Marcus wasn't sure he understood what she was suggesting. Partners how? I have money, Rachel said simply. Not a fortune, but enough to help with the debt. Money I've been saving for starting over in a new place. The offer hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. Rachel, I can't ask you to risk your savings on a struggling ranch. You're not asking, she pointed out. I'm offering. And it wouldn't be charity. It would be an investment in our future. Our future? Rachel's cheeks colored slightly, but she met his eyes steadily. I care about this place, Marcus. I care about what we've been building here, and I care about you more than I probably should after such a short time. The honesty in her voice made Marcus's heart race. Over the past weeks, he'd been increasingly aware of his growing feelings for Rachel, but he'd assumed those feelings weren't reciprocated. The thought that she might see their partnership as something more than temporary employment changed everything. How much money are we talking about? He asked carefully. $400, Rachel replied. It's everything I have, but it would cover half the debt. And if we can raise the rest somehow. That's your entire future, Marcus protested. Everything you've saved for starting over. Maybe my future is here, Rachel said quietly. Maybe starting over means staying in one place and building something worthwhile with someone who matters. Cornelius, who had been grazing nearby during the confrontation with the bankers, chose that moment to wander over and push his head between them, as if sensing the importance of their conversation and wanting to be included. Even Cornelius thinks it's a good idea, Rachel said with a shaky smile. Marcus reached up to scratch the donkey's ears while his mind raced through the possibilities. Rachel's $400 would indeed cover half the debt, and if he sold his remaining cattle and equipment, he might be able to raise most of the rest. It would leave them with almost nothing to work with, but it would buy them time and keep the ranch out of Hartwell's hands. More importantly, it would mean Rachel wanted to stay permanently, wanted to build a life here with him. The prospect filled him with a combination of hope and terror that left him almost breathless. "It's a big risk," he said finally. "The best things usually are," Rachel replied. Marcus looked around at the ranch that had been his family's legacy for 3 generations. Then, at the woman who had transformed it from a burden into a source of hope in just 2 weeks. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. "Partners," he said, extending his hand to her. "Partners," she agreed, taking his hand in both of hers. This time their handshake felt less like a business arrangement and more like a promise of something deeper and more lasting. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. But even as hope bloomed in his chest, a part of him wondered if they were being naive about the challenges ahead. Hartwell and his associates didn't strike him as men who would accept defeat gracefully, and there were still too many unknowns about what the future might hold. Still, looking at Rachel's determined expression and Cornelius's patient presence, Marcus felt more optimistic about facing those challenges than he had about anything in 2 years. Tomorrow would bring new problems and new obstacles, but tonight, for the first time since Elena's death, he wouldn't face them alone. The morning of reckoning arrived with deceptive calm. Marcus stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cool dawn air, watching Cornelius graze peacefully in the paddock. 3 weeks had passed since Rachel's offer, 3 weeks of frantic planning and careful preparation. Today, Samuel Hartwell would return for his answer. Rachel emerged from the barn, her face set with quiet determination. In her hands, she carried a leather satchel containing $400 in carefully saved bills. Every cent she owned in the world, now committed to a future neither of them could guarantee. "Ready?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch steps. Marcus nodded toward the road, where dust clouds announced approaching riders. "Here they come." Hartwell arrived with the same 2 investors, their expressions confident with anticipated victory. They dismounted with the casual authority of men accustomed to taking possession of other people's dreams. "Mr. Reed," Hartwell called, his voice carrying false cheer. "I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer." "I have," Marcus replied, stepping down from the porch with Rachel beside him. "And I'm prepared to settle my account in full." Hartwell's confident smile flickered. "In full? That's quite ambitious for a man in your circumstances." Rachel stepped forward, raising the leather satchel. $400 cash. She set it firmly on the porch railing. "Mr. Reed's contribution to clearing his debt." "And the remainder?" one of the investors asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Marcus gestured toward the corral, where his remaining cattle stood gathered. "Livestock sale, arranged through Peterson's auction house. $320, confirmed this morning." He produced a bank draft from his pocket. "The remaining balance comes from equipment sales and my personal savings." Hartwell's face darkened as he realized his carefully planned acquisition was slipping away. "This is highly irregular. We'll need to verify these funds, ensure everything is legitimate." "By all means," Rachel said smoothly, "though I believe cash and certified bank drafts speak for themselves." The next hour passed in tense negotiation, as Hartwell and his associates tried every possible objection to delay or complicate the payment. But Marcus and Rachel had prepared thoroughly, anticipating each challenge with proper documentation and legal counsel from Cedar Falls. When the dust finally settled, Hartwell departed with payment in hand and murder in his eyes. The ranch remained firmly in Marcus's possession, though the victory had cost them nearly everything they owned. "We did it," Rachel said quietly, watching the bankers disappear over the horizon. "We did," Marcus agreed, then turned to face the woman who had risked everything for a future she'd known him barely a month to build. "Rachel, what you did today, was an investment in us," she interrupted, color rising in her cheeks. "In whatever we're building here." Cornelius wandered over from the paddock, sensing the importance of the moment. The donkey had recovered completely from his injury, his limp now just a memory. He nuzzled Rachel's shoulder affectionately before turning his attention to Marcus, as if formally approving the partnership. "Smart donkey," Marcus murmured, scratching behind Cornelius's ears. "Knew a good thing when he saw it." "Speaking of good things," Rachel said, her voice suddenly shy, "I should probably mention that my feelings about this arrangement aren't purely business." Marcus felt his heart skip. "Neither are mine." The kiss that followed was soft and tentative, the first acknowledgement of emotions that had been building for weeks. When they parted, Rachel was smiling with genuine happiness for the first time since he'd known her. "So what happens now?" she asked. Marcus looked around at his ranch, no longer his alone but theirs together. The buildings needed work, the pastures required rebuilding, and they had almost no money left for operations. But they had each other, they had Cornelius, and they had time to make it work. "Now we build something," he said simply. "Something lasting." 6 months later, the Triple Crown Ranch bore little resemblance to the struggling operation Marcus had been barely maintaining alone. Rachel's irrigation improvements had transformed brown pastures into green meadows. Cornelius had become an indispensable part of daily operations, his intelligence and sure footing making him perfect for the mountain trails where horses struggled. The wedding had been simple, held in the small church in Cedar Falls with Doc Peterson serving as witness. Rachel had never found her Aunt Catherine, but she'd discovered something better, a home where she belonged, a partner who valued her contributions, and a future built on shared dreams rather than inherited obligations. Standing on their porch that evening, watching Cornelius supervise the new calves they'd been able to purchase with careful savings, Marcus marveled at how completely his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a lonely widower counting down to inevitable failure. Now he was part of a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. "Regrets?" he asked Rachel as she settled beside him. "Only one," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I wish I'd found this place sooner." Cornelius brayed his agreement from the pasture, and they laughed together as the sun set behind the mountains they now called home. Sometimes the best things in life arrive dusty and tired, with a limp and an uncertain future. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a woman with a lame donkey, willing to risk everything for the chance to build something real. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to recognize the gift when it appears on your doorstep, you discover that home isn't a place you inherit. It's something you choose to create with someone brave enough to stay. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.